Lucy, this young man, Jacob Brown, isn't just good looking. His career is already secured. By the end of the year, he'll leave the military and report straight to the Railway Bureau. A stable, lifelong job. Are you sure you're going to pass on this? When I caught the matchmaker's excited expression, I realized something. I had been reborn. I was back at the point in time when the Brown family sent a matchmaker to my house. This time, I made a decision opposite to the one I made in my previous life. I don't want to meet him. The matchmaker panicked. Lucy, don't be so hasty. Let me tell you about Jacob Brown. He's not only handsome, he's known for his excellent character. You wouldn't find anyone like him within 100 miles. Do you even know how many young women dream about him? Memories of my previous life flooded my mind. I closed my eyes briefly, then interrupted her. I know. The matchmaker froze for a moment, seemingly caught off guard. She must have noticed something unusual. When I nodded, her confusion deepened. In my past life, I had indeed met Jacob Brown before the matchmaker had come to arrange this marriage. It was during the first month of my internship at the clinic in 1990. One night, while I was on duty, a family member of a patient stormed into the hallway with a kitchen knife, yelling angrily, "You heartless doctors! I'll make you pay with your lives." His crazed actions, wildly swinging the knife, terrified everyone into staying back. I was scared too, but as the only doctor on duty, I couldn't hide or run. My whole body was trembling as I stepped forward, trying to negotiate with him. "Sir, please, let's talk calmly." "There's nothing to talk about," he screamed. "I'll take one of your lives for his." The moment he saw me, his emotions spiraled out of control. Like a raging bull, he charged at me with the knife raised. The corridor was filled with screams as people scattered, trying to get away. My legs felt like they were cemented in place, unable to move. I closed my eyes instinctively, bracing for the pain of the knife's blow, but it didn't come. When I opened my eyes, a man stood between me and the attacker. With immense strength, he had grabbed and immobilized the hand holding the knife. Amid the chaos, he even turned to glance at me briefly. "Are you okay, miss?" I was too stunned to speak and could only shake my head. Soon, the attacker was subdued, but the man who had shielded me left without giving his name. I thought it would be almost impossible to find him, but before I could start asking around, a patient who had witnessed the incident recognized him immediately. "That young man is Jacob Brown from Old Brown's family. He's a soldier, just back home visiting his family." I committed Jacob Brown's name to memory. So, when the matchmaker mentioned his name, I agreed without hesitation. But that simple nod of mine caused Jacob Brown to hate me for the rest of his life. "Lucy, since you've met him, you know I'm not lying. This is a great match." The matchmaker thought there was still hope and continued promoting Jacob Brown. However, while thinking of Jacob, another name surfaced in my mind. Seeing me stay silent, the matchmaker opened her mouth to speak again, but I interrupted her. "Wait. Lucy, the Brown family is indeed a good match," I said, "but the one I want to meet is Jacob Brown's older brother, Robert Brown." After escorting the matchmaker out of the yard, I was about to head back inside when I heard someone call my name. The familiar voice sent a chill down my spine. I turned around abruptly, and there he was, Jacob Brown, standing under the pomegranate tree outside the yard. The man I remembered as a gray-haired elder was now a young man in his prime. Standing beside him was a woman in a white dress, Jasmine White, the woman he cherished for his entire life. Seeing me turn around, Jacob paused briefly before saying something to Jasmine. Their gazes lingered for a moment before they parted, and Jacob approached me. Standing before me, Jacob got straight to the point. "Lucy Carter. This time, I won't marry you. You should give up on that idea." The coldness in Jacob Brown's gaze pierced me, identical to the way he had looked at me in my past life when he watched me fall to ruin. But I caught something in his words, a crack in his statement. He said, "This time." Combining that with my memories of the past, I realized something crucial. When the matchmaker had come to discuss our marriage, Jacob had still been in the military. My first formal meeting with him hadn't been until 3 months later, during the Laba festival. In just a few seconds, it became clear to me, Jacob Brown had also been reborn. His sudden appearance here could only mean one thing. He must have snuck away to stop Jasmine White from marrying someone else. And while he was at it, he was also here to prevent me from becoming his wife again. Pretending to be clueless, I gave him a blank look. Who are you? Jacob seemed startled for a moment. Then realization dawned on him. Of course. How could you possibly? He glanced at me again but stopped mid-sentence. Yet I could guess the rest of his unspoken words. How could you have been reborn too? What about me? I asked, feigning confusion. Nothing. Jacob cleared his throat as if trying to dismiss the thought. I'm Jacob Brown. My parents just sent the matchmaker to your house. Didn't they? I nodded, then pretended to have an epiphany. Oh, so you're the Jacob Brown the matchmaker mentioned. I acted as though I were meeting my blind date for the first time, deliberately giving him a scrutinizing look from head to toe. Jacob seemed nervous, his brow furrowing as if afraid I might actually like him. Lucy Carter, he began, his tone wary. I came to see if. Before he could finish, I interrupted, pretending to be disappointed. Wow, so the matchmaker said you're supposed to be 8 feet tall and as handsome as Adonis. How come you look like this? Jacob froze mid-sentence, stunned by my dismissive tone. Hey, I added with mock disdain. It turns out the matchmaker was full of lies. What a joke. My critical tone left Jacob staring at me, utterly baffled. What do you mean by that? For all his confidence, Jacob had always been a bit vain. In our past life, he had been the most sought-after bachelor in the village, famous for his good looks. He'd never had to worry about finding a match. Back then, his parents had met me during a visit to the clinic. They had liked my gentle demeanor and polite manners, which led them to arrange the matchmaker's visit. To unsettle Jacob further, I continued with a nonchalant shrug. You didn't know? When the matchmaker praised you, I was actually intrigued and wanted to meet you. Hearing this, Jacob's tense expression eased slightly, and the corner of his mouth curled up in subtle relief. But just as quickly, his faint smile disappeared when I added, but now that I've met you in person, I've realized you're just average. Your looks, average. Your build, average. Even your personality, nothing special. Honestly, you're not my type at all. I paused for effect, then delivered the final blow with a smirk. It's not just this life. I wouldn't marry you in the next life, or the one after that. Jacob's pupils contracted slightly as he processed my words. Lucy Carter. You. Jacob Brown. I cut him off firmly. I believe this is our first meeting. Please address me as Miss Carter. His eyes locked onto my face, his voice laced with disbelief. You're serious about not wanting to marry me? Of course. I replied without hesitation, nodding for emphasis. Hearing my answer, Jacob pressed his lips together, momentarily lost for words. He should have felt relieved, but a shadow passed over his expression, as though my response had caught him completely off guard. I could tell he had expected me to throw a tantrum, clinging to the idea of marrying him no matter what. Instead, I had said something entirely unexpected, that I wasn't interested in him at all. Good. That's good, he finally said, nodding slowly as if trying to convince himself. Jacob Brown gave me one last cold glance before turning and walking back toward Jasmine White. I couldn't hear what he said to her, but her shy smile immediately gave her emotions away. The two of them walked away side by side. I didn't sit idle either. As soon as I returned to the house, I grabbed some paper and a pen, quickly drafting a formal report about Jacob's unauthorized leave from his unit. The matchmaker was efficient. It wasn't long before she came back with news about Robert Brown. However, her phone call didn't bring good news. Lucy, she said hesitantly. Robert declined. He already has someone in his heart. She tried to persuade me to reconsider Jacob. Her words left me deep in thought. So Robert already had someone he liked. Even this early on, in my previous life, I had only met Robert twice. He was 4 years older than Jacob, and the two were half-brothers, born of the same father but different mothers. After their father remarried, Robert moved south with his uncle. He attended college there and stayed to run a business, rarely returning home. The first time I met Robert was at my wedding with Jacob. It was a brief encounter during the banquet. Later that night, Jacob had been heavily drunk, carried back to our room in a near unconscious state. Once the guests had left, I changed out of my wedding dress and busied myself preparing hot water to help him wash up. Afterward, I stepped out into the courtyard for a moment to rest, leaning against the steps. I hadn't noticed anyone else was there until a deep voice emerged from the darkness. "I never thought the one he married would be you." Startled, I looked up. Beneath the locust tree stood a man, his sharp features illuminated by the faint moonlight. His face was cold and enigmatic. After a moment of hesitation, I recognized him. It was Robert Brown. He stared at me for a long moment before murmuring, almost to himself, "Why did it have to be you?" I didn't understand what he meant. Then the strong smell of alcohol hit me, and I realized he must have been drinking heavily. I assumed he was just drunk and talking nonsense, so I turned to leave. But before I could, Robert followed me. Frightened, he quickly called out, "Big brother." My words seemed to snap him back to reality. His gaze swept over my face, lingering for a moment. Then he stepped back, putting a safe distance between us. With a faint, bitter smile, he said, "Sister-in-law, congratulations on your marriage. I wish you both a long and happy life together." After saying that, he turned and disappeared into the night. The second time I saw Robert was after I had been driven to death by Jacob and our son. When my soul left my body, it didn't immediately fade away. Instead, I hovered in the air, watching as Jacob and our son frantically tried to save me. They rushed me to the hospital. But when the doctor announced my death, neither of them shed a single tear. Instead, my son let out a sigh of relief. "Dad, finally. Now she can't interfere with your plan to be buried with Jasmine in the future." I had thought that death would bring an end to all pain, but hearing those words sent a cold shiver through my soul. Jacob, too, sighed with apparent relief. "Yes, now I can finally be with Jasmine openly. I only hope that in our next life, I'll meet you again, Jasmine." Jacob handled my funeral with shocking indifference. He took me straight from the hospital to the crematorium, then casually buried my ashes in a remote cemetery. He didn't even bother with a proper service, merely sending a brief message about my death in the family group chat. And that was the sum of my life, tied to Jacob Brown. Watching it all unfold, I felt only one word in my heart: regret. If I were given another chance, I will never marry Jacob Brown again. Just as my soul was about to dissipate, Robert Brown appeared at my grave. He bent down, his aging hands trembling as he gently touched the photo on my tombstone. His gaze was filled with such tenderness and sorrow as he softly repeated my name. "Lucy, Lucy, Lucy. I'm so sorry. I was too late." In that moment, I realized that in this world, in a place I had never known, someone had deeply, painfully loved me. "Do you have Robert Brown's address?" I asked the matchmaker. The matchmaker had no idea why I wanted it but still managed to find it for me quickly. Once I had the address, I spent the entire night thinking about what to write. As dawn broke, I decided to use a spare photo from my work ID and penned a single line on the letter paper. "Hello, Mr. Brown. I am your prospective match, Lucy Carter." After sending the letter, I went to the clinic to start my shift. To my surprise, the first patient I received was Jasmine White. Jacob wasn't with her, which likely meant he had quietly returned to his unit. "Dr. Carter, we meet again," Jasmine said with an overly familiar tone as she took a seat. I glanced at her briefly. "We've met before?" I wasn't close to Jasmine in my past life. We had met no more than 10 times. The first time was on the road when she returned home after her husband's death. I had no idea back then that she was the woman Jacob cherished in his heart, and I had even warmly pointed her in the right direction. "You don't remember?" Jasmine asked, her tone laced with mock surprise. Her reaction made me pause. Could she have been reborn too? But before I could delve into it, she continued, "I was standing right next to Jacob when he came to tell you he wouldn't marry you." So, she hadn't been reborn. I pretended to remember. "Oh, I see. I didn't pay much attention at the time." Jasmine's lips twitched, clearly dissatisfied with my answer. "What brings you here? Are you unwell?" I asked. "Dr. Carter, I'm not here for treatment." Jasmine crossed her legs, exuding an air of unwarranted superiority. I'm here to tell you that Jacob loves me. So, stop clinging to him. I looked at her as though she were delusional, remaining silent, mistaking my silence for acquiescence. Jasmine pressed on. Do you think secretly maintaining contact with Jacob's parents behind his back will get you anywhere? This is the modern era of free love. Jacob has already promised me that once he returns from the army, we'll get married. At that, her meaning became crystal clear. All I had done was send the matchmaker to inquire about Robert Brown. But in Jasmine's eyes, it had somehow turned into me pestering Jacob. This misunderstanding, however, sparked an even better plan for pulling Jacob down with me. I smiled faintly and said, "You're right. I do like Jacob. And Jacob's parents have made it clear that no matter how much he loves you, they'll never let you into their home. Unless, of course, you show up pregnant." The moment the words left my mouth, I covered it with my hand in feigned shock. Jasmine's expression shifted, her pride visibly wounded. Before leaving, she sneered, "Lucy Carter, with your intelligence, it's a wonder you became a doctor." Watching her leave, I couldn't help but smirk. I hope she doesn't disappoint me and brings me some useful news. Moments later, another patient walked in, glancing toward the door Jasmine had just exited. "Dr. Carter, was that woman here for a checkup? A venereal disease? Perhaps." I raised my eyes and said flatly, "Doctors are obligated to maintain patient confidentiality regarding any condition." I looked at the elderly woman and replied firmly, "We don't discuss other people's private matters here." She sat down, undeterred. "You don't have to say anything. I already know." I stared at her in confusion. "Why do you say that?" She leaned in, adopting the tone of someone sharing village gossip. "Dr. Carter, don't be fooled by her good looks and clean clothes. She works in a dance hall. How many decent people work in places like that? Men and women coming and going all the time. Who knows what they're doing inside? It's filthy. If I had a daughter like that, I'd beat her to death." I didn't know much about Jasmine White's background, but this gave me some insight. It seemed that Jacob's parents didn't approve of her and refused to let her into their family, likely because of her job and the reputation it carried. The days that followed were relatively quiet. I found myself counting on my fingers, estimating when Robert Brown might receive my letter. In this era, the fastest delivery for a letter was about a week, but it could take as long as 2 weeks or even a month. A month passed, but I still hadn't received a reply from Robert. Anxiety began to creep in. Had he not received it? Or had I been mistaken from the start? Perhaps Robert's feelings weren't for me at all. As my mind spiraled with doubts, I made a bold decision. I requested leave from work and prepared to head south to find Robert and ask him directly. 3 days later, I arrived at the address the matchmaker had given me. The door was opened not by Robert but by a strikingly fashionable young woman. She greeted me in a regional dialect I didn't understand, then switched to halting, accented Mandarin. "Who are you looking for?" I suddenly felt a wave of nervousness. I'm looking for Mr. Brown." A man's voice called from inside the house. "Who is it?" I froze, unable to speak. Reflexively, I glanced at the slip of paper with the address. It was correct. Then I looked back at the woman in front of me. My heart sank. "Sorry, I must have the wrong address," I mumbled before quickly turning away. I had just entered the stairwell when I heard their conversation behind me. "Who was that at the door?" the man asked. "A pretty woman," she replied casually. "She said she had the wrong place." "Forget about it," the man said. "It's rare for us to have the house to ourselves today." The door closed with a heavy thud, cutting off the rest of their conversation. I leaned against the concrete wall, taking deep breaths as a strange sense of guilt washed over me. Then, unable to help myself, I muttered bitterly, "Lucy Carter, you've really embarrassed yourself this time." But even as I closed my eyes, my mind couldn't help but replay the image of Robert standing at my grave, tears streaming down his face. The despair, the pain, it was so vivid. Still, it was clear now. Robert had someone else in his life. I wouldn't intrude. That same day, I booked a train ticket home for the evening. Time slipped by in the midst of this back and forth. Before I knew it, the end of the year had arrived, and Jacob Brown had completed his service and returned home. I saw him again outside a state-run restaurant, His parents, eager to celebrate his return, had organized a gathering of family and friends to welcome him back. Inside, the atmosphere was lively, filled with praise for Jacob's obedience, filial piety, and bright future at the Railway Bureau. There was even talk of finding him a good match. No one could have anticipated that Jacob would bring Jasmine White to the gathering on such a joyous day. Humiliating his parents in front of everyone, the two of them arrived together at the entrance, and as they turned, they spotted me walking out of the restaurant. The smiles on their faces instantly vanished. Jacob was the first to react. "What are you doing here?" I met his gaze calmly. "Why shouldn't I be here?" I rolled my eyes at Jacob Brown. "Is this restaurant yours?" "Lucy Carter. Is that how you talk to me?" Jacob's brow furrowed deeply, clearly displeased. In my previous life, I had been married to him for 50 years and never once stood up to him. It led him to believe he could still treat me the same way now. I curved my lips into a slight smile. "Jacob Brown, do you really think you're that important? It's a pity. You've got the arrogance, but not the fate to match it." His face darkened further at my words. His fist, hanging by his side, clenched tightly, and I could see the impulse to hit me flash in his eyes. I wasn't afraid. If he dared lay a hand on me, it would only hasten the consequences of my report to his unit. They wouldn't need to investigate further before kicking him out of his prestigious Railway Bureau position. Jasmine White, surprisingly the more rational one this time, pressed her hand against Jacob's and gave him a warning look, silently urging him to stay calm. She then stepped forward, puffing out her chest as if to defend her man. "Lucy Carter, I know why you're here. You heard Jacob was back and wanted to use his parents' presence to force another meeting with him, didn't you?" I almost laughed at her assumption. So much for giving her credit for intelligence. "Lucy Carter, I didn't expect you to be so shameless. I've already made it clear. I'm never marrying you. Just give up." As Jasmine spoke, Jacob's expression shifted as if he'd suddenly understood something. He looked at me with a dawning realization, as though this ridiculous assumption now made perfect sense to him. Jasmine continued smugly, "But let me tell you, don't waste your efforts. It won't work." She touched her stomach in a subtle motion, but it was enough. I immediately understood what she was implying. She was pregnant. Jacob, however, didn't seem to know. "Jasmine, let's not waste words on her," Jacob said, clearly eager to get away from me. He didn't even want to spend another second in my presence. Placing his hand on Jasmine's back, he guided her inside. Jasmine flashed Jacob a sweet smile. "Okay, Jacob, I'll listen to you." I watched them walk away, their faces full of smiles. Smirk all you want now. It won't be long before those smiles turn into tears. The very next morning, news about Jacob and Jasmine had already spread. Even the cleaning lady took a moment to gossip while sweeping. "Did you hear? Old Brown's son came back from the army and immediately got tangled up in a scandal. Knocked some girl up already." I heard. "Lucy, did you hear about this?" I was just passing by when the cleaning lady called out to me, pretending to know nothing. I asked, "Hear what? You don't know? Let me tell you." The cleaning lady's eagerness to share was almost tangible. "Last night, after you left, Jacob brought Jasmine home to meet his parents. Before Jacob could even say a word, his father saw Jasmine and immediately shouted, 'Get out!' She clapped her hands for emphasis. Scared Jasmine so much she burst into tears right there. Jacob, of course, couldn't stand to see her cry. He shielded her behind him, and the argument quickly escalated. His parents even mentioned your name." "Really? What did they say?" I asked casually. "They told him, 'Son, you're letting this fox enchant you. Any woman off the street would be better than her. Look at Dr. Carter from the clinic. Her looks, her education.'" This point, the cleaning lady lowered her voice, mimicking Jacob. "And you know what he said? 'Dad, I will never marry anyone but Jasmine. If you try to force me to marry Lucy Carter, I'd rather die in a car accident today.'" Hearing this, his father was so furious he nearly fainted on the spot. No matter how private the room was, such a commotion couldn't stay hidden for long. Soon, people in the restaurant began gathering outside their door, drawn by the shouting. When they looked in, They saw Jasmine kneeling tearfully in front of Jacob's parents, crying so pitifully it tugged at their hearts. Through her sobs, she pleaded, "Uncle, Auntie, I know you don't like me." Jasmine White pleaded, her voice soft and tearful. "But Jacob and I truly love each other. Please, I beg you, let us be together." Jacob's mother pointed at Jasmine, her voice sharp with anger. "Fox spirit, you're nothing but a homewrecker." Jasmine lowered her head, silently enduring the barrage of insults. When Jacob's mother finally ran out of steam, Jasmine lifted her head slightly and said, "I'm pregnant with Jacob's child." Her words hung in the air, silencing the entire room. Jacob's parents were stunned, and even Jacob himself looked completely taken aback. At this point, there was no room left for his parents to oppose the relationship. Begrudgingly, they helped Jasmine to her feet and closed the door to discuss the marriage arrangements in private. But it was a busy restaurant, and gossip spread like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone was talking about it. She finished her tale with a satisfied grin. Before she could continue, a nurse interrupted us. "Dr. Carter, someone's here to see you." "Who is it?" I asked casually. "I don't know," the nurse replied. "But he's tall, handsome, and very distinguished looking." Curious, I stepped outside. The moment I saw him, I froze. It was Robert Brown. This was the third time I had seen him across 2 lifetimes. His features were even more striking than I remembered. His face sharp and refined. He wore a brown trench coat that perfectly complemented his commanding presence. His arrival turned heads, as passers-by couldn't help but steal glances at him. Within moments, Robert approached me. He wasted no time, speaking urgently. "I received your letter." Memories of my failed visit to the South flashed through my mind. Quickly composing myself, I lied without hesitation. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brown, but I didn't send any letter." Robert's eyes widened slightly. "It wasn't you?" "No," I said, sticking to my story. "It must have been my younger cousin playing a prank." Internally, I winced at my excuse. "Sorry, little cousin. You're taking the blame for this one." Robert's gaze didn't waver. His sharp eyes locked onto mine. "But they said you came looking for me a month ago. Is that true?" My lie unraveled before me, leaving me no choice but to confess. "Fine, Mr. Brown. Yes, I sent the letter. And yes, I came looking for you. But at the time, I didn't know you were married." "Lucy," Robert interrupted firmly. "I'm not married. I don't even have a girlfriend." I stared at him, stunned. "But He seemed to anticipate what I was about to say and began explaining. "For years, I've avoided contacting my family, but I couldn't cut ties entirely. The address I gave them was for my business partner. The people living there aren't related to me, and I didn't receive your letter right away." His explanation caught me off guard. "How can I be sure you're telling the truth?" I asked, hesitant. He looked genuinely pained by my distrust. "You don't believe me, Lucy. After everything I had endured in my previous life, I was no longer the naive girl I once was." My silence stretched on for several seconds. Robert seemed to take my hesitation as his answer. With a quiet sigh, he said, "All right, I understand." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I watched his retreating figure, a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside me. My heart skipped a beat. He's leaving just like that? Halfway through his departure, as if suddenly remembering something, Robert Brown turned back and said to me, "Lucy Carter, wait for me. Promise me you'll wait." Then he disappeared into the crowd. I stood there briefly, lost in thought, before refocusing on my work. The next time I saw Robert was 2 days later. In the afternoon, I had just finished my shift when he arrived. This time, though, he wasn't alone. He was dragging another man by the collar as he hurried toward me. "Explain," Robert demanded, shoving the man forward. The man brushed at his collar in annoyance. "Let go of me. You're going to ruin my shirt." Just then, a head peeked out from behind the man. When they saw me, they exclaimed in broken Mandarin, "Oh, pretty lady. We meet again." I blinked in surprise. You too." Robert released the man and gestured toward him. "This is Song Hao, my business partner and friend." Song Hao straightened his collar and greeted me with a smile. Dr. Carter. Hello. At Robert's pointed look, Song Hao quickly wrapped his arm around a woman standing beside him. This is my wife, Meng Jia. To ensure I believed him, he even pulled out their marriage certificate, holding it up for me to see. The whole display left me torn between amusement and exasperation. It was only then that I fully understood Robert's earlier words. Wait for me. He had gone to great lengths to bring Song Hao and Meng Jia here, flying them into the province and then taking an overnight bus, all just to prove the truth to me. In that moment, it felt as though my heart had been struck by a sugar-coated missile, sweet and overwhelming. As we sat together, Song Hao filled me in on the details I hadn't known. It turned out that my letter had arrived just a week after I sent it. However, it had been buried in a pile of other correspondence and ignored. At the time, Robert was away in Nanyang. It wasn't until he returned and sorted through the letters that he found mine. When Meng Jia saw the photo I'd included, she suddenly remembered meeting me before. Once Robert learned I had come looking for him, he couldn't wait any longer and rushed to find me. So that was the truth of it all. When I looked back at Robert, he was watching me, his eyes brimming with love. Do you believe me now? He asked softly. I nodded. I do. Whether in my past life or this one, I truly believed him. Robert Brown genuinely loved me. Ignoring the curious stares of passers-by, I stepped forward and embraced him. Robert, let's get married. The day we went to register our marriage, we were just leaving the Civil Affairs office when we ran into Jacob Brown and Jasmine White. Jacob's eyes immediately locked onto me. Lucy Carter, big brother. He froze when he noticed Robert standing beside me. His gaze dropped to our intertwined hands, and his face filled with shock. You two, how are you together? Robert, acting as if he were guarding a treasure, quickly pulled me behind him, as though afraid Jacob might take another look at me. Compared to Jacob, Robert remained composed and unbothered. He chuckled coldly. Why are you so surprised? Lucy Carter, come here. Jacob barked, his voice filled with frustration. Explain yourself. Why are you with my brother? In our past life, Jacob had always been jealous of Robert. That jealousy carried into this life. And now he was directing all his anger at me. I wanted to step forward and confront Jacob, but Robert firmly held me in place, refusing to let me go. From behind Robert Brown, I shot back at Jacob Brown. It's none of your business. Perhaps Jacob was so overwhelmed by the scene in front of him that he lost his composure. Lucy Carter, do you even know that you're my wife? The moment those words left his mouth, Robert's fist connected with Jacob's face, sending him stumbling back a few steps. Robert towered over him, glaring down. Watch your mouth, he said coldly. She's my wife. Jacob licked the blood off the corner of his mouth, seemingly ready to argue back. But Jasmine White quickly grabbed his arm. Jacob, stop. Her voice brought him back to his senses. Perhaps he remembered that I had once been his wife, but only in a past life. However, that stubborn, suffocating possessiveness of his refused to let him back down easily. You know what, Lucy? Jacob sneered, trying to provoke me. I get it now. You couldn't marry me, so you turned to my brother just to spite me, didn't you? Even now, Jacob still thought I couldn't live without him. This time, I stepped out from behind Robert, meeting Jacob's self-assured and angry gaze. Calmly, I said, Jacob Brown, do you know what you look like right now? Confusion flickered across his face. Pointing to a pile of dog waste by the road, I said, that. Jacob's face twisted with fury. You're comparing me to dog shit. No, I corrected him, my tone icy. You're worse than dog shit. Robert seized the moment to step in. Darling, there's no need to waste words on people who don't matter. It's beneath you. You're right, honey, I said, flashing Robert a sweet smile. Let's go. We turned and walked away, leaving Jacob behind. His teeth were clenched so tightly in anger that I thought they might shatter. Fine. Jacob roared after us. Very well. Lucy Carter, if you knew what happened in your past life, you'd regret the choices you've made today. But before he could see me regret anything, Jacob found himself regretting instead. Moments later, several uniformed officers approached him. After presenting their documentation, they informed Jacob he needed to return with them for an investigation. Robert, seemingly eager to tell the world that I was his wife, had somehow procured a bag of candies. Everywhere we went, he handed them out, greeting people warmly. As a result, I heard every well-wish imaginable that day. Some people recognized Robert. "Hey, aren't you Old Brown's eldest son? You're back." Though Robert didn't like being referred to as Old Brown's son, he simply smiled and replied, "Yes, it's me." Someone else chimed in. "So the Browns sent a matchmaker to Dr. Carter's house not for their youngest son but for their eldest? Who would have thought Old Brown's eldest son would be so handsome? He and Dr. Carter look amazing together." By the time we returned home, the sky was nearly dark. Ever thoughtful, Robert heated water to soak my feet. When he held my foot to remove my shoes, I instinctively pulled back. Feeling awkward, he looked up at me. "What's wrong?" Embarrassed, I laughed nervously. "They smell." Of course, my feet didn't actually smell, but this was the first time anyone had done something like this for me, and I felt uneasy. Robert said nothing, simply removing my socks. Then, to my shock, he leaned down and kissed the top of my foot before looking up at me with a soft smile. "Smells sweet," he said. I was utterly stunned. "Haha, my dear wife." Robert Brown chuckled, nudging me gently. "In my eyes, everything about you is perfect." I closed my gaping mouth in disbelief. Is this what they mean by love makes the lover's eyes see beauty everywhere? As that thought crossed my mind, a memory from my past life suddenly surfaced, eerily similar to this moment. I was about 8 months pregnant, my belly so large that bending over was nearly impossible. I had asked Jacob Brown to help me trim my toenails, afraid he might find it disgusting. I had even scrubbed my feet with soap and rinsed them carefully beforehand. But Jacob had looked at me with cold disdain. "You want me to cut your toenails? That's disgusting." Love, or the lack of it, was such an obvious thing. Only now, in this life, did I fully realize that truth. "What are you thinking about?" Robert asked. Noticing my distraction, I snapped out of my thoughts and met his gaze. "Oh, nothing." "As a doctor," I began, "I should tell you that feet can harbor fungus. It's not a good idea to kiss them." Robert clearly hadn't expected such a blunt and unromantic response, but he nodded earnestly. "All right, I'll listen to you." Still, thoughts of Jacob lingered in my mind. I felt there were things I needed to clarify with Robert. "Robert," I said, patting the empty seat beside me, "sit here. I want to talk to you about something." "What is it?" he asked, his deep eyes fixed on mine. "It's about Jacob Brown," I started, but Robert interrupted me. "Lucy, I have something to tell you first." "All right," I said. "I had a dream," Robert began. "In it, I saw you married to Jacob Brown." My heart skipped a beat. Could Robert have been reborn too? But as he continued, I realized it was just a dream, a vivid reflection of my past life. Robert's eyes softened as he looked at me. "Lucy, I've never been afraid of anything in my life. But when I woke up from that dream, I was terrified. I was scared you had really married Jacob. Scared that I'd lose you to him forever. That's why the first thing I did was go to Nanyang. I ended all my business there as quickly as I could. I wanted to find you before it was too late." His words brought tears to my eyes. I couldn't hold them back. "Thank you, Robert. Thank you for loving me, even in this life." Robert gently wiped away my tears. "You silly woman. What's there to thank me for? It's you and me. No need for thanks." Despite the warmth of the moment, a question lingered in my mind. Robert and I had never met before this life. How had he come to love me so deeply? After some persistent questioning, Robert finally confessed. It turned out he had seen me once before. Many years ago. I had been just 15 or 16 at the time, wearing 2 simple braids and following an adult around. I couldn't recall the scene he described, but it had stayed with him vividly. "When I first saw you," Robert admitted, "it was your beauty that caught my eye. But after that, I couldn't forget you." His honesty made my heart ache in the best way possible. "I've spent all these years trying to find you," Robert Brown said, his voice soft yet firm. "Finding you feels like my destiny, and now that I have, I won't let you go." I couldn't imagine how just a fleeting glance in a crowd had been enough for Robert to decide on me. But in my past life, he truly had been alone, without anyone by his side. Being loved by him felt incredible. Our eyes met, and the emotions between us deepened. Robert leaned closer, clearly intending to kiss me. I suddenly covered his mouth. He looked at me with a hint of grievance. Wife. I hadn't forgotten that he had just kissed my foot. Go brush your teeth. 10 times. Not a single one less. All right. Robert agreed obediently and went off to brush his teeth. The next time I heard news of Jacob Brown was half a month later. By then, I had resigned from my job at the clinic and was preparing to move to a southern city with Robert. While I was packing up my office, Jasmine White suddenly barged in. Seeing me, she rushed forward and grabbed my hand. Dr. Carter, help me. I looked at her, confused. Dr. Carter, can you perform an abortion for me? Jasmine asked, her eyes filled with desperation. Staring at her, I couldn't help but glance down at her noticeably swollen belly. You want an abortion? You're almost 5 months along. Yes, just reached 5 months, she replied anxiously, suppressing my shock. I said firmly, I can't do that. At this stage, it's no longer an abortion. It's an induced labor. I won't perform such a procedure. Hearing my refusal, Jasmine looked like she was about to cry. Dr. Carter, I know I've said many awful things to you before. I was out of my mind. Please, don't hold it against me. I'm begging you. Please help me. I'll even get on my knees if that's what it takes. As she spoke, she started kneeling down. To be honest, I didn't like Jasmine White. In my past life, part of the reason I died in anger was because of her. But when I thought about it, I didn't hold a grudge against her strong enough to let her grovel like this. I reached out, trying to pull her up. If you have something to say it standing up. Don't kneel like this. I won't get up unless you agree to help me, Jasmine said resolutely, willing to risk everything. Then don't get up, I replied bluntly, refusing to engage in her theatrics. I let go of her and continued gathering my belongings to leave. Panicked, Jasmine quickly stood up and chased after me. Jacob Brown is in trouble. I stopped and turned to look at her. Jacob's downfall was something I had foreseen, but I still wanted to hear it from her directly. After Jacob left his unit without authorization, someone reported him. Jasmine explained hastily. Following an investigation, the charges were confirmed. Now he's facing a 3-year prison sentence. And his job at the Railway Bureau is gone. She looked at me with pleading eyes. I can't let this child grow up with a father in prison. And I can't let this child ruin my life, either. Dr. Carter, as one woman to another, please help me. Her eyes, filled with desperation, seemed to see me as her last lifeline. Seeing how eager Jasmine was to sever ties with Jacob and get rid of his child, I couldn't help but say, Jasmine, don't you know how much Jacob loves you? He loves you so much that he'd sacrifice his life for you. Loves you enough to die for you. He even dreamed of being buried alongside you, hoping to be your husband again in the next life. I said flatly. Jasmine White sneered. Who cares about his love? Love doesn't fill your stomach or pay the bills. I hadn't expected Jasmine to be so clear-headed at such a critical moment. I couldn't help but feel a bit of admiration for her. As we spoke, Jacob Brown's parents stormed into the hospital, followed by a swarm of relatives. His aunts, uncles, cousins, and more. The moment they spotted Jasmine, they surrounded her on all sides, their voices overlapping in a barrage of accusations. Jacob's mother pointed a finger at her. Furious. Jasmine White, don't you dare think about getting rid of my grandson. Dr. Carter, help me. Jasmine clung to my arm, desperate. In the end, she was dragged away by the Browns. If nothing unexpected happened, Jasmine would be forced to give birth to the child. I remembered that in my previous life, Jasmine had a congenital heart condition and died in her early 40s. I couldn't help but wonder if she would survive childbirth in this life. That moment, I found myself hoping for her safety, for both her and the child's. And, secretly, I hoped that child might be my son from the past life. After all, in their previous lives, Jacob and our son had dreamed of a perfect, happy family of 3 with Jasmine. Still, I doubted Jacob's future would be peaceful. He was no longer the man he had been in our past life, a man of status and wealth. But people always have to pay a price for what they seek. As the setting sun bathed the world in golden light, Robert Brown reached for my hand. "Lucy," he said softly, "from now until the end of our days, I'll rely on you." I smiled, my heart full of warmth. "Robert, Mom, may the rest of our lives be filled with happiness and harmony." Today is Aunt Grace's 70th birthday celebration. Dad isn't coming back. You should go to bed early, okay? Lisa and I need to head over too. Big brother and third sister are already there. I'm leaving as well. My youngest son's voice carried a trace of impatience as he pulled his wife toward the door. I struggled to sit up, reaching out weakly to stop him. But the door shut firmly. The last thing I saw was his annoyed expression. And the last thing I heard was his voice fading into the distance. So irritating. Every time Aunt Grace wants us to spend time with Mom, she has to create some kind of scene. And now she's pretending to be seriously ill. Only I'm dumb enough to fall for it. None of my siblings came back. They must have already seen through her tricks. His wife tried to calm him down. "Stop it. Let's go quickly. I heard Aunt Grace's son bought a villa and plans to move Dad there. I want to see what the villa looks like." I closed my eyes weakly, tears streaming uncontrollably down my face. My body felt like it was burning, as though I really was about to die. Memories of my pitiful life flashed through my mind. Nathan and I weren't introduced by a matchmaker. He was a platoon leader, and I was a performer in the cultural troupe. He was quiet and serious, with an air of integrity. That's why I married him. And it marked the beginning of a life filled with sorrow. He was too upright. Every month, most of his $110 subsidy was used to help the poor soldiers under his command. I tried to persuade him to save some for us, but he accused me of not caring about his subordinates. Later, I convinced myself that such a caring man must have good qualities. I silently accepted his actions. But when I became pregnant and could no longer perform, leaving me with only a basic salary, life became difficult. During holidays, when someone complained to him about their struggles, he would hand over our rice or flour, often coming home empty-handed. Each time, I waited eagerly, only to be disappointed. I also wanted to celebrate the new year properly. We began to argue. He thought I was being unreasonable. After I gave birth to our eldest son, I started asking for his salary every month. He thought I had changed and looked at me with disdain. But when I saw our skinny little boy crying from hunger, I had no choice but to fight for it. Perhaps there wasn't much love between us to begin with. Our marriage became an empty shell. He stopped coming home, choosing to stay at the barracks instead. My mother-in-law had to step in and force him to return. Eventually, we had more children, and perhaps he realized how hard raising kids could be. He started leaving half of his salary for us each month. I was content with that. Life finally seemed to stabilize, but fate had other plans. The platoon leader who accompanied him on a mission never came back. Nathan took on the responsibility of caring for his family, often spending entire days helping them. Gwen, a widow with 2 children, had lost her pillar of support. I felt sorry for her, but my sympathy ended the day Nathan brought them home. With military housing in short supply, Gwen was about to be sent back to her hometown. Nathan sat silently on the bed all night, unable to accept it. I tried to comfort him, saying he'd done everything he could, but I never imagined he would make such an outrageous decision. Without consulting anyone, Nathan brought Gwen and her children to our house. Seeing them standing in our cramped 2-bedroom home, I lost it. I fought with him like a madwoman. How can we possibly fit 6 people in this tiny house? Where are they supposed to stay? That was the first time Nathan hit me. His eyes were bloodshot as he slapped me hard across the face. He glared at me, then turned and walked out with Gwen. He carried her luggage and had 1 child on each shoulder. Gwen followed him, sobbing with every step. They looked more like a family than we ever did. He never once helped me carry even a single onion, nor had he ever carried our children on his shoulders. But outside, he had built another home, his and Gwen's home. Every month, he only gave me 1/3 of his salary. The rest went to Gwen and her family. For the sake of my children, I endured it. As he climbed the ranks smoothly, people began to assume Gwen was his wife. I was forgotten by everyone. Even my children grew closer to Gwen because she made them new clothes and bought them snacks. They didn't know how much effort it took just to keep them alive. No one knew that I was so hungry every day I survived on nothing but cold water. No one saw me arguing with the cafeteria manager just to get one extra steamed bun for my kids to eat. Every time this happened, Gwen would step in, dressed immaculately, and smooth things over on my behalf. Everyone praised her for being so gracious. I, on the other hand, was like a rat living in the gutter. But they all forgot that the clean clothes on her back and the money in her hand should have been mine. Even the man standing impatiently by her side, glaring at me, should have been mine. Before I married Nathan, I had been the star performer of the cultural troupe, a well-educated and elegant woman. But everyone now gravitated toward Gwen. When Nathan was reassigned to a new position elsewhere, he took Gwen and her family with him. I didn't even know they had left until a month later. By then, I could no longer cry. There wasn't any time for tears. The kids needed food. They needed schooling. And I needed to stay alive. I struggled for years, taking care of Nathan's parents and raising the children. By the time I saw them again, the kids were grown, and Nathan and Gwen returned, looking like an ill-matched pair. To everyone else, though, Gwen was now Mrs. Colonel. I stood quietly in the crowd, unnoticed. Nathan glanced at me briefly but didn't recognize me. Gwen did. Her face showed a hint of awkwardness, and she tried to pull her hand away from Nathan's arm, but he held onto her firmly. Her face turned red as she looked at me with an expression full of apology. Everyone around them praised their decade-long love story. I slipped away silently. Perhaps it was better this way, as though we had never known each other. The children were mine alone now. Or so I thought. When my children heard that Nathan had returned, they all ran to find him. Seeing their shabby clothes, Nathan scolded me viciously, accusing me of being so stingy that I wouldn't spend a penny on them. He blamed me for the hard life his children had endured. Then Nathan took all the children away. I cried and begged him not to take them. But Gwen stepped in, shielding the children, and said I was scaring them. I knelt before her, pleading with her not to take my children. Nathan pushed me aside roughly, dusting off Gwen's skirt as he said coldly, "Don't get close to her. She's filthy. You're not her match." Gwen frowned. "Nathan, don't. This is my fault. I've taken so much from her over the years. I know how much pain she's endured." Nathan looked serious. "You've never taken anything from me, Gwen. You've always urged me to come back. But I was the one who didn't want to. It's not your fault. Don't feel guilty. From now on, I'll make it up to the kids." Gwen tried to say something else, but Nathan held her hand and led her away. My children followed them without hesitation, leaving me alone in the broken home. They left without a trace of regret. Even now, as I lie on the brink of death, they think I'm just wasting their time. How laughable. My body feels weaker by the second. Perhaps I really am dying. Maybe that's for the best. This world is too bitter. I don't want to come back here again. I sank into darkness. When I opened my eyes again, there was a loud knock at the door. "Lillian, Lillian, get up. The captain is calling for you." I instinctively let out a faint groan, my body reacting faster than my mind. Slowly, I put on my neatly ironed clothes and opened the door. The man on the other side looked me up and down and asked, "Why aren't you wearing a dress? This is such a rare opportunity." That's when it hit me. Today was the day the captain was taking us to meet the soldiers stationed below. It was at this evening event that I had first met Nathan. The memory of my miserable previous life made my face turn pale. "I'm not going," I said. "I don't feel well." He frowned. "How could you suddenly not feel well? Can you manage?" Perhaps my face was too pale. As he seemed to believe me, I recognized him. My good friend, Chrisjo. He was the only one who had ever warned me not to marry Nathan. Someone like him, Chris had said, is the least suited for a normal life. If you ever fight, everyone will take Nathan's side. His face alone represents righteousness. Back then, I didn't believe him. Now, I did. Chris left, still half doubting me. I leaned against the door and slowly slid to the ground. This time, I absolutely couldn't marry Nathan. As I was lost in thought, the captain came in with a sigh, grabbed my arm, and started pulling me outside. "Lillian, you have to go today. Last time, you claimed to be sick. The whole troop is already there except for you. If you don't go this time, people will start saying you're trying to create class divisions. I knew the captain meant well. In my last life, I had always thought he was overly strict and dismissive of people. But it was him who fought to get me my basic salary, who urged me to stay strong during countless lonely nights. That small income was the only thing keeping me alive. The captain hurriedly walked ahead but paused when he noticed my silence. Seeing my slightly red eyes, he was stunned for a moment. You're really feeling that bad? He loosened his grip on my hand, as though about to say something, when a cheerful voice interrupted. What's going on here? I turned toward the voice and saw a dark-skinned man approaching. Behind him stood Nathan. At this time, he was still young and fresh-faced, his features rugged, his expression serious. I couldn't stop trembling. It was anger mixed with fear. I wanted nothing more than to strangle him right then and there. My entire wretched life had been ruined by him. Nathan seemed sensitive to others' gazes. He lifted his head and met my eyes, only to feel an inexplicable tightness in his chest. Why did this woman look like she wanted to kill him? The captain quickly stepped in, shielding me from view. He chuckled and said, "It's just for the celebration. Lillian has a high fever and even cried about wanting to tough it out, saying, 'A performer is still a soldier. We can endure hardship.'" The company commander clapped his hands in approval. What a good comrade. But since her fever is this bad, let's not push it. She should go back and rest. Then he turned to Nathan. "Nathan, take her back." Nathan immediately straightened, responding with a firm, "Yes, sir." His voice was so strong that the captain immediately understood. This must be someone Nathan was interested in. That might not be a bad thing, he thought. Lillian, although picky, was hardworking and had a good heart. If the two of them could truly connect, it might work out well. With that thought, the captain left with the commander, leaving me standing there. Nathan took a step closer, then another, until his shadow enveloped me completely. I stared at the ground, at the dark silhouette looming over me, feeling an inexplicable fear rising in my heart. In my last life, Nathan had arrived much earlier. Why was it different this time? I didn't dare think further. Turning around, I broke into a run. Nathan froze for a moment before quickly following me. The closer his footsteps got, the faster I ran. The uneven path nearly made me trip. "Careful," Nathan called out, reaching out to catch me. Every hair on my body stood on end. Even if I twisted my ankle, I wasn't going to let him touch me. I thought I would fall embarrassingly to the ground. But the next second, someone caught me around the waist. I opened my eyes to see a cocky face smirking at me. "Well, Lillian, this time it seems you're the one throwing yourself into my arms." Behind him, Nathan's brows furrowed. "Comrade, mind your words." I saw with my own eyes that this young lady was about to fall. "What you said is inappropriate and unkind to a respectable woman." Crisho, the man who had caught me, pulled me behind him protectively. "And who do you think you are?" Nathan's expression turned serious as he introduced himself formally. "Nathan Carter, infantry. Now, please release this young lady." I had never heard Nathan say so many words at once, but his stern tone reminded me of something important. Wasting no time, I broke free from Chris's grip, ignoring them both, and limped away. My ankle was injured, making my steps uneven. I didn't want to see Nathan, nor did I want to see Chris. The last time Nathan had brought Gwen and her children to our home, it was Chris who had stood up for me and fought Nathan. Gwen was the widow of a fallen soldier. And Chris, knowing his temper and principles, couldn't stay in the army much longer after that. He retired soon after, and I never heard from him again. When I finally reached the dormitory entrance, a young woman with a ponytail and a basket in her hand walked by. My pupils dilated in shock. It was Gwen. I hadn't realized we had crossed paths this early in life. Gwen glanced at me, curled her lips in disdain, and brushed past, bumping my shoulder as she went. Every few steps, however, someone grabbed her by the collar and dragged her back. "What are you doing? Why are you grabbing me like this?" Gwen protested. Nathan's cold voice replied, "Apologize." Gwen looked up at Nathan's rigid demeanor. He was still a regular soldier at this point. A simple private, but he carried himself with an intimidating presence. Fine. I'll apologize, Gwen huffed, rolling her eyes before running off. Nathan watched her retreating figure. His brows furrowed tightly. A rude woman like that was exactly the kind of person he despised. I couldn't help but find it ironic. Supporting myself on the handrail, I climbed the stairs step by step, ignoring Nathan's outstretched hand. Once I reached my room, I closed the door behind me without a word. I knew Nathan too well. He had his principles, and if he promised the commander he'd see me to my door, he would do just that. It was laughable. Nathan could keep every promise he made to others, but the one he had made to me, to treat me well, had been completely forgotten. Nathan stood outside the door for a long time, trying to figure out what he had done wrong. Why did this woman seem to hate him so much? What had he done to provoke such hostility? With those thoughts weighing on his mind, he returned to the commander. The commander greeted him with a cheerful grin. That young lady's name is Lillian. She's the star performer of the cultural troupe. I've looked into her. She's a bit picky, but she's hardworking. She'll stay up all night perfecting a dance routine. I think she'd be a good match for you. Nathan couldn't help but recall Lillian's face. Against his better judgment, he didn't object. The commander laughed heartily. I knew it. You've always had high standards. I've introduced you to so many women, and you never gave any of them a second glance. Turns out you prefer pretty girls after all. Nathan immediately looked up, his face serious. His ears turned red. Commander, it's not like that. I just think she's unique. The commander gave him a knowing smile. All right. I get it. The cultural troupe will only be here for a few days. You should spend more time with her. Good women are in high demand. Nathan didn't say whether he would or wouldn't, but the next morning, before dawn, he was already waiting downstairs. He didn't even know why. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Lillian's gaze would appear, keeping him restless through the night. Frustrated, he decided to wait for her instead. When I woke up, the morning chill hit me, snapping me out of my grogginess. Carrying my wash basin, I headed out, where Chris was already waiting by the door. We walked side by side to the washing area, and he chatted cheerfully about the amusing things that happened the previous day. I wasn't really listening. Instead, I found myself drawn to the happy faces around me. After marrying Nathan in my past life, there were so many people I never saw again. Suddenly, Chris nudged my arm and gestured outside. Turning my head, I saw Nathan standing there. I immediately dropped my gaze. Nathan strode over, carrying a lunchbox. Comrade Lou, this is breakfast I brought for you. I stared at the lunchbox in his hand. In both this life and the previous one, this was the first time Nathan had ever brought me food. In my last life, when I was in the hospital giving birth alone, I had told him I was hungry and worried I wouldn't have the strength for labor. Nathan had brushed it off, telling me to endure. He said everyone was suffering and asked why I had to act so delicate over childbirth. His words made me cry uncontrollably. Annoyed, he left and didn't return until after the baby was born. When he finally showed up, it was only for a quick glance. He said his subordinate's wife was also in labor, and since the subordinate was on a mission, he needed to take care of her instead. I was too thirsty to speak, and my baby, crying from hunger, had a red face from all the screaming. It was someone from the next room who finally took pity on us and brought over some formula for the baby. Meanwhile, Nathan had been up early to queue for formula to deliver to his subordinate's wife. How ironic. Chris noticed I wasn't reacting and kicked me lightly. Startled, I snapped back to reality, looked at Nathan coldly, and said, "Thank you, Comrade Carter, but I'm not hungry." Nathan's hand tightened around the lunchbox, and he looked unsure of what to do. "Comrade Lou, did I offend you somehow?" "No," I replied curtly. "We don't even know each other." Nathan had never encountered such a response before. He had always been kind to others, and this situation was completely new to him. After a pause, he bowed deeply. Startled, I took a few steps back. Nathan straightened up, his expression serious. "I'm sorry, Comrade Lou. I don't know how I might have offended you, but if I did, I sincerely apologize." I wanted nothing more than to sever any connection with him. Shaking my head repeatedly, I said, "No, that's not it. I just don't want to get married right now. I only want to focus on dancing. Nathan pressed his lips together, clearly disappointed. He placed the lunchbox into my basin and walked away briskly. I hurriedly took a few steps after him, but he quickened his pace even more. With a sigh, I gave up. Chris came over, grinning mischievously. So, when did you two meet? Why didn't I know about this? I told him everything that had happened the previous day. Neither of us thought much of it at the time. But later that evening, the commander came to see me. His expression stern. Lillian, how could you let a soldier bow to you? This is a serious matter. You need to write a self-critique about this incident. You also need to formally apologize to Comrade Carter. I was completely dumbfounded, but it was him who. The commander cut me off. Say nothing more. This matter has caused a negative impression. The company commander personally came to demand an explanation, so it must be addressed. Biting my lip, I realized once again that any involvement with Nathan brought nothing but trouble. Chris grinned and wrapped his arm around the commander's shoulder. Commander, don't be so serious. This isn't Lillian's fault. Nathan showed up early in the morning, bringing breakfast and bowing like that. It startled even me. The commander's anger softened a bit, but he didn't relent. I took the written self-critique and followed him to the unit. Soldiers were training diligently along the road as we walked. The commander knocked on the office door and led me inside. The moment I stepped in, my eyes landed on Nathan. The commander gave me a look, and I understood. Taking a deep breath, I approached Nathan, lowered my head, and bowed deeply. I'm sorry, Comrade Carter. Nathan immediately shook his head and tried to help me up, but I stepped back to avoid his hand. Straightening up, I began reading my written apology aloud. When I finished, I took out a food ration coupon and handed it to Nathan along with the lunchbox. Comrade Carter, I didn't know where to return your lunchbox, so I failed to give it back in time. That was my mistake. The food inside was shared with others, which was wrong of me. Here is your ration coupon. I don't know why you bowed and apologized to me, but I'm returning the gesture twice over to express my regret. I truly apologize. Nathan scratched his head, clearly flustered. The commander cleared his throat, prompting me to step back and stand quietly behind him. The commander spoke earnestly to the company commander. Lillian is straightforward and focused solely on her dancing. If there's been any misunderstanding, it's better to clear it up now. The company commander's expression stiffened. His original intent had been to subtly match the two of us, thinking that once we became a family, any misunderstandings would naturally resolve. Nathan looked at me seriously, his tone tinged with disappointment. Is that how you see it too, Comrade Lou? I nodded firmly. I only want to dance. Nathan's eyes dimmed instantly. When we left the office building, the commander glanced at me and sighed. Lillian, if you have no interest in Nathan, you should find someone like-minded and settle down quickly. The mention of marriage filled me with dread. Commander, I really don't want to get married. The commander sighed again. It's not about what you want. Don't underestimate how stubborn those in charge can be. They'll pair you up with someone whether you like it or not. I can see they've already set their sights on you. A chill ran through me, and I felt utterly defeated as I returned to the dormitory. Chris was already waiting for me. Well, how did it go? He asked. I collapsed into his arms and began sobbing. Why is my life so miserable? If the company commander insists, even the commander won't have a reason to refuse. For women in the cultural troop, once we reach a certain age, we either get discharged or get married. I'll have to choose one. To everyone else, discharge was considered the worst possible outcome. I spent the entire night thinking, even if it meant giving up dancing, I couldn't bear to repeat the hardships of my previous life. So, I submitted my application for discharge. When the commander saw the application, he was stunned. Is marriage really such a difficult thing? I wasn't forcing you to marry right away. Choking back tears, I replied, I don't want to trouble you anymore. I can't find the right person, and I don't want to get married. The commander looked at me for a long moment before letting out a heavy sigh. Then do you have any requests? I have only one. My voice was steady. Commander, I want to perform on stage one last time. In my previous life, I left the stage too abruptly. This time, I want to say a proper goodbye. The commander hesitated briefly before nodding in agreement. That evening, there was already an internal performance scheduled. Feeling excited, I made my way back to prepare. Along the way, I saw a lively group of soldiers congratulating someone. In the center of the crowd was Gwen, dressed in a red outfit with red ribbons tied to her braided pigtails. Standing beside her, smiling shyly, was her husband, the same platoon leader who had tragically passed away around this time in my previous life. Now, he was already a platoon leader, as indicated by the insignias on his shoulders. No wonder Gwen had sneered and called Nathan a lowly grunt that day. At this moment, Gwen was smiling sweetly, handing out rock candy to everyone. When she got to me, she let out a cold huff. Her husband nodded at me apologetically, clearly uneasy. Gwen's eyes were filled with hostility as she clung to her husband's arm, whining, "I've been walking all day, and my feet are so sore. Hold me, will you?" Her husband's ears turned red as he obliged, supporting her as they walked away. Gwen glanced back at me with a smug, triumphant smile. In that instant, something clicked for me. Maybe, in my past life, Gwen didn't love Nathan at all. She simply figured out how to exploit his principles to her advantage, securing countless benefits, a comfortable life, and a happy family. While my children grew up ordinary and unremarkable, Gwen's 2 sons eventually became high-ranking officers in the military district. Understanding this, I didn't know whether to feel sorry for Nathan or to laugh at myself. I pushed the thought aside and focused entirely on my performance that evening. I poured every ounce of understanding from both this life and the last into my final dance. With each step, I conveyed the desolation and absurdity of my life, the bitter humor and sorrow of it all. As I collapsed to the ground like a dying swan, I truly believed I had perished in that moment. But the thunderous applause that filled the air pulled me back to reality, wiping the tears from the corners of my eyes. I stood up. The audience was packed with people, company commanders, battalion commanders, platoon leaders, and countless soldiers. Their gazes were intense, their words direct. "Comrade Lou, when you fell to the ground, I wanted to grab a gun and shoot anyone who had ever hurt you," one soldier said, his voice raw with emotion. Chris clapped so hard his hands turned red. The commander, his eyes red with tears, came forward and hugged me tightly. Nathan was among the crowd as well, and even his eyes glistened with moisture. When I fell during the performance, Nathan had felt a wave of indescribable sadness that made him want to lash out at anyone who had caused me pain. To him, I was someone so wonderful, someone he wanted to protect and cherish, to never let shed another tear. Resolving himself, Nathan stepped forward, but Chris beat him to it. Chris removed his military badge, handing it to me with a rare solemnity that replaced his usual carefree demeanor. "Comrade Lou," he began, "I like you very much. I hope I can have the opportunity to pursue you with marriage in mind. I swear on my badge that at home, your word will be my command. I will follow your every order. As long as I'm not on duty, all my time will be yours." Nathan's gaze darkened, and he stared at me intently. Chris's sudden confession left me flustered, and without thinking, I blurted out, I don't want to have children. Children are nothing but trouble." My words made everyone present frown. A woman who doesn't want children? What kind of woman is that? What's the point of marrying her? Even the commander tugged at my sleeve, showing his disapproval. Chris was momentarily stunned but quickly composed himself. "That's a serious question, Lillian. I'll need to think about it carefully. Can you give me a day?" I didn't expect him to respond this way, so I nodded. After all, it would take a few days to process my discharge paperwork anyway. The crowd dispersed, and Nathan tried to approach me, but the commander subtly blocked his path. The commander was visibly frustrated. "Lillian, such a promising talent, leaving over something like this. It's infuriating. But what can I do? The company commander's backing is too strong." Chris turned to Nathan with a sneer. "You're Nathan, aren't you? Satisfied now? Meeting you has been the unluckiest thing to ever happen to Lillian. If she doesn't want to deal with you, she has to quit and go home. Sure, we're just performers, not heroes willing to spill blood and sacrifice ourselves like you soldiers. But we're human too. Do you have any idea how much Lillian has suffered? She was sold off by her parents, beaten within an inch of her life, and only managed to find a bit of peace when she joined the cultural troupe. Why do you have to make things so hard for her? Chris's voice trembled as tears streamed down his face. I felt like a bystander to my own story, detached from the painful memories Chris brought up. I had long since buried those moments. Looking back now, I realized that in my past life, the reason I married Nathan was simply because I wanted a home of my own. I was like an unwanted stray, with no one who cared enough to stay by my side. I thought marriage would bring me protection, but it had all been an illusion. Back in the dormitory, I began packing up things I didn't need anymore and shared them with my fellow performers. We hugged each other tightly, tears brimming in everyone's eyes. Suddenly, the door burst open. Nathan stood there, his breathing uneven. He grabbed my arm and started pulling me outside. I shook him off after several tries. "Comrade Carter, what do you think you're doing?" Nathan's gaze was serious as he looked at me. "I'll marry you. Don't leave." I stared at him warily. Nathan let out a helpless laugh. "I'm not a bad person, Lillian. Please don't treat me like I'm your enemy. I like you. From the moment I first saw you, I liked you. I don't know why things turned out like this, but I swear I never wanted to force you to leave. Maybe I used the wrong approach. I thought you were like me, someone who followed orders from the organization. How do you divide your monthly salary?" I interrupted him abruptly. Nathan seemed taken aback but answered honestly. "As a platoon leader, I get $115 per month, including allowances. Some of the soldiers in my unit have families in extreme difficulty. I give $20 to each of the 3 families. That leaves $15, which I'd give to you." I covered my face, unable to suppress a bitter smile. "But I want the best face cream, the most fashionable clothes, a new outfit every month. I also need to eat meat regularly. Your $15 wouldn't even cover that." Nathan's expression grew even more serious. "Face cream? You can use barrier cream. It's only 2 cents each. Clothes? If they're not worn out, they can be mended and reused. Meat? Once a month is doable." I suddenly burst out laughing. Nathan looked at me, bewildered. It took me a while to calm down and meet his gaze again. "I'm not marrying you. Everything I want, I can already have. Even if I leave the troop, the severance pay will be enough for me to live comfortably for a year or 2. But if I marry you, I'll have none of that. Instead, I'll have to cook, clean, and do your laundry. And I'll have to take care of you, cook for you, and have your children. Nathan, tell me, what do I get out of marrying you?" Nathan looked stunned for a moment, lost for words. "You'd marry me to live a stable life. Of course. Isn't that what marriage is about? A husband provides food and clothing." I laughed bitterly. "Marrying you wouldn't leave me starving. Sure, but I wouldn't live happily, either. I'm not stupid. Why would I marry you?" With that, I turned and walked away. Nathan stood there, frozen in place. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. Every time he gave his money to soldiers in need, they would thank him profusely, saying that whoever married him would be the luckiest woman alive. The next day, Chris didn't come looking for me, which didn't surprise me. After all, who would want a wife who didn't want children? On the 3rd day, the company commander summoned me privately. His words were veiled, but his meaning was clear. I had led Nathan astray. Over the past 2 days, Nathan had been distracted during training. His shooting accuracy, which was always perfect, had suddenly declined. I wanted to scream, to flip the table in anger, but I couldn't. Instead, I smiled and accepted the criticism. And so, once again, I stood in front of everyone and read my self-critique, bowing deeply to Nathan. I said, "I'm sorry, Comrade Carter. I've already submitted my discharge application. I truly have no way to connect with you. I apologize." The company commander's face turned completely dark. He suggested I have a private conversation with Nathan. Why should I meet with him privately? Words can destroy a reputation. If anyone saw us and rumors started spreading, even jumping into the Yellow River wouldn't clear my name. I'd have no choice but to marry Nathan. In my past life, I might have fallen for it, but not this time. I didn't want to stand next to Nathan for even a second longer. This time, very few people sided with Nathan. Anyone with eyes could see that the fault wasn't mine. After all, I was already being forced to leave. Nathan stood there, dazed, as I walked away without looking back. On the 5th day, my discharge paperwork reached its final stage. The commander urged me to reconsider, but I shook my head firmly. With a resigned sigh, he stamped the documents and handed them to me. Take this to the logistics office. Once you're registered, you can leave any time. I sincerely thanked the commander, not just for his help in this life, but also for the support he had given me in my past life. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a voice behind me. Wait. Chris stumbled into the room, clutching his backside, his steps uneven. With a loud thud, he dropped to his knees in front of me. Startled, I quickly stepped back. Chris grabbed my hand, refusing to let go. Lillian, you heartless woman. I nearly got beaten to death because of you. And now you're leaving. I saw the cold sweat dripping from his temples and couldn't bring myself to pull away. What happened to you? Ignoring my question, Chris countered with one of his own. Did you mean it when you said you'd marry someone without having kids? It's true. I replied cautiously, but I didn't say I'd marry you. I only meant. Chris shook his head vehemently. I don't care. My parents have already accepted that they won't have grandchildren. You have to marry me now. The commander rushed over in a few quick strides. Is this for real? Chris gritted his teeth. I'm still injured. If I hadn't heard that this heartless woman was planning to run away, I'd still be lying in bed for another 3 days. The commander's face lit up with delight. He grabbed my discharge application and tore it into shreds. All right. I approve of this marriage. Chris, write up your application immediately. Nathan offered to help submit my paperwork for the marriage approval. Chris, trembling slightly, pulled a pre-filled application form from his pocket. His details were already neatly written out, leaving only my information to complete it. The commander, thrilled, took the form and nudged me to fill it out. I hesitated, feeling like I was walking straight into a trap. I had no intention of stepping into another pitfall. The commander grinned. This form was filled out 6 months ago. Chris, you've been planning this for a while, haven't you? I glanced down at the date on the form. Sure enough, it had been prepared long ago. Chris, embarrassed, covered his face. What can I say? Love at first sight. But Lillian always said I'm full of sweet talk and prefers men who are quiet and serious. I immediately looked up. I don't like that type anymore. Chris's eyes lit up. Great. Then you can like me instead. Sweet talk is my specialty. I'm number 1. The commander burst out laughing. All right, Lillian. No children means you can keep dancing forever. I'd really hate to see you leave. Don't worry. Your position will always be here. You were born to dance. Under the commander's persuasion, I reluctantly agreed. He left with the paperwork, looking delighted. Chris's eyes crinkled in a wide grin. And despite myself, I felt a little better seeing his happiness. You're really this happy? I asked. Chris nodded enthusiastically. Lillian, I like seeing you shine on stage. Even after we're married, I won't make you stop dancing. I'll handle everything at home. If I'm out on a mission, my mom will come and help. Don't worry. She'll leave once she's done. She won't interfere. She's very respectful of boundaries. I couldn't help but laugh. Who talks about their mom like that? Chris shrugged nonchalantly. You'll understand when you meet her. She's very open-minded. But for now, I need your help getting up. I quickly helped him to his feet. He winced dramatically, clutching his backside and groaning. His antics made me laugh so hard my stomach hurt. As I helped Chris out of the compound, a military vehicle was waiting at the gate. Seeing Chris approach, the driver quickly opened the door. Chris held onto my hand tightly, refusing to let go. Why not just come with me to meet my parents today? He said. No time like the present. I looked down at my casual clothes, hesitating. I can't meet them like this. I need to dress properly. Chris ignored my protest and tried to pull me toward the car. Just as I resisted, a shadow darted over, yanking Chris away and grabbing my wrist, pulling me behind him. Chris let out a pained yell, collapsing into the arms of a nearby soldier who rushed to support him. Blood began seeping through Chris's pants. Breaking free from the grip holding me, I ran to Chris. Are you okay? Nathan frowned, pulling me back toward him. I didn't use any force. He's faking it. Nathan, I snapped, shaking his hand off. The commander said I'm getting married. It's already been reported. Nathan's face fell, his expression one of disbelief. How could you be so impulsive? This is a decision that will affect your entire life. I let out a cold laugh. In my previous life, Nathan had married me within 5 days. Wasn't that impulsive? Nathan's gaze grew urgent as he tried to reason with me. I've thought it through. You were right. I shouldn't prioritize other families over my own. From now on, my entire stipend will go to you. Marry me, and you'll only have to have one child. I don't have any bad habits, and there are no shameful connections in my life. I am innocent. Chris chimed in. I've lived an honest life too. Who here isn't clean and decent? We all are. Nathan, clearly displeased, glared at Chris. I'm speaking to Lillian. Chris tugged at my sleeve. You promised me. You won't go back on your word. Right. His eyes were filled with anxiety. I held his hand firmly and looked at Nathan. If I marry him, I won't leave anything behind for you to hope for. With that, I led Chris into the car, glancing back at Nathan. Nathan, don't approach any other women for now. Nathan's eyes lit up, but I smiled faintly. Even if you do meet someone, it will only be a fated tragedy. Next year, you'll find the one who truly suits you. As the car drove away, Chris leaned closer to me. You know how to predict destinies too? I smiled softly and shook my head. I asked the driver to stop at a grocery store, bought a few things, and then allowed the car to continue. We eventually arrived at a military district compound, filled with elegant 3-story Western-style houses. Only those with high positions could live here. Lower ranks didn't qualify. Following Chris, I walked inside. A woman wearing a blue padded jacket, carrying a basket, came out and called loudly into the house. Ma'am, the young master has returned. Chris frowned. Didn't I tell you not to call me that? The woman slapped her mouth lightly. Right. Not young master. It's Madame Jo bringing someone home. Chris rolled his eyes in exasperation while I pressed my lips together, stifling a laugh. A moment later, a woman in a dark navy dress embroidered with Solomon's seals came out. It was Chris's mother. Nervously, I nodded in greeting. She gave me a once-over, inspecting me from head to toe. You're quite pretty. I can't believe you take a liking to someone like Chris. Your tastes are interesting. Mom, Chris called out, exasperated. His mother patted her chest in mock shock. Why are you shouting? You nearly gave me a heart attack. Hurry inside. I want to have a chat with my future daughter-in-law. Once inside, I placed the things I had bought on the table and pulled out a teal silk scarf with gold trim. Twisting it delicately, I fashioned it into a rose before draping it around her neck. Her eyes lit up instantly as she rushed to grab a mirror, admiring the scarf from every angle. She then took me upstairs to help her pick out outfits that matched. In my past life, I had bought the exact same scarf for Nathan's mother, but she scolded me for wasting money and warned me against buying such useless things. Once we started a family, Chris's mother, on the other hand, was completely different. She asked me how I made the rose shape with the scarf and insisted I teach her. The Jo family was far easier to get along with than I had expected. Their words were logical and thoughtful, and they never once mentioned the issue of not having children. After lunch, Chris's mother washed dishes alongside Aunt Jean, refusing to let me lift a finger. Later, she sliced fruit and brewed floral tea for me. This brought back memories of my first visit to Nathan's home in my past life. His mother had immediately demanded to see my cooking skills, tying an apron around me and sending me into the kitchen to prepare a meal. After I finished cooking, I wasn't allowed to join them at the table. Women should eat in the kitchen, she had said. That day, I sat alone in the kitchen, eating cold food while Nathan's family ate in the dining room. They occasionally shouted at me, demanding I bring more dishes or clean up after them. By the time I finished serving everyone and returned to the kitchen, the food had gone completely cold. When the meal was over, they all waited for me to clear the table and do the dishes. Nathan's mother criticized my cleaning, saying the plates weren't spotless enough. By the time I was done, everyone had gone to bed. Feeling my way through the dark house, I nearly tripped over something. Nathan's mother had prohibited me from lighting a candle, saying it was wasteful and that I was being too pampered. I stumbled back to bed, my body aching. Nathan was already fast asleep. That was the first time I felt disappointed in him. Later, I consoled myself, thinking, this is just how life is for everyone. But now I wonder, if I had been braver back then and left immediately, would I have avoided the sadness that followed? Chris's mother patted my shoulder, snapping me out of my thoughts. The floral tea she had brewed for me seemed endless, and we talked until we lost track of time. As evening approached, I mentioned that I needed to leave. Chris's mother insisted on having a personal guard escort me home, and reminded me not to go out the next day because she planned to visit me. I nodded obediently. Chris's mother watched me leave with a satisfied smile. However, my good mood vanished the moment I saw Nathan standing nearby. I couldn't understand why he seemed to have nothing else to do. In my past life, even when we got married, he barely had time to attend the ceremony, constantly making excuses about helping a friend or aiding someone in need. Nathan stood there straight as a steel rod, like a soldier on duty. "Comrade Lou," he called out. I ignored him, lowering my head and continuing forward. Nathan stepped in front of me, blocking my path. His voice was cold and hard, sending a shiver down my spine. "Look at me," he said. Reluctantly, I raised my head. Nathan's eyes were filled with pain. "Comrade Lou," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I've been named model soldier every year. My reputation among the proletariat is spotless. Why can't you consider me?" I had never seen Nathan with such an expression before. Anguished and humiliated. I couldn't help but laugh. "Nathan, you're truly disgusting." His face stiffened, turning pale with embarrassment. Ignoring his reaction, I continued, "You knew all along that I had submitted my discharge application, didn't you? But you said nothing. It wasn't until I mentioned marriage that you reacted so strongly. Admit it. You're nothing but a selfish, narrow-minded person. You see my leaving the army as a punishment for not marrying you. Marrying someone else goes against your wishes, so you keep pestering me. Nathan, you're the type of person who only craves obedience from others. You want a wife who stands out, a reputation that shines, and the moral high ground at all times. You want it all. But Nathan, you're the one who's truly calculating and manipulative." Nathan's expression darkened completely, his face unreadable. I pushed past him without looking back. I didn't know when he finally left, nor did I care. The next morning, Chris's mother arrived bright and early, with no parents of my own. The commander had taken on the role of my guardian. Chris's mother brought a generous dowry of $580, an unprecedented amount. In the military, weddings were quick and straightforward. Once the report was filed, we were officially married. Chris and I got our marriage certificate and hosted a banquet. When we reached the table where the company commander Saturday, he praised our union as a perfect match. Chris's parents nodded in satisfaction. Meanwhile, Nathan sat stiffly at the same table, his face pale, his lips unable to form even the slightest smile. His eyes brimmed with sorrow. After the guests left, Chris and I went upstairs. Every item in the room was clearly arranged with care. Chris pulled back the blanket, revealing the bed sprinkled with decorative items. I picked up a basin, intending to clean up. These items were expensive, and I wanted to store them properly. Chris stopped me. "Sit down and rest. I'll take care of it." He carefully gathered everything, tidied the blanket, and rearranged the bed with practiced ease. Watching him work so skillfully, I couldn't help but recall my wedding night in my past life. Nathan had come home drunk, vomiting all over the floor. I spent the night cleaning up after him, scrubbing the floor and washing him up. By the time I finished, it was already the middle of the night. I dragged my exhausted body to bed. In my previous life, Nathan pressed down on me without a care, completely ignoring what was beneath me. Nathan's mother, always eager to save money, had filled the mattress with small stones to make it look more presentable. The thick comforter gifted to me by the cultural troupe had been taken away, leaving only a thin blanket. That night, I was cold, uncomfortable, and in pain, crying multiple times. Afterward, Nathan rolled over and fell asleep without a word. I got out of bed, my legs trembling, and went to wash up. By the time I finished cleaning, The first rays of dawn were breaking through the sky. Nathan's mother banged on the door, demanding breakfast made by my own hands. Thinking about those mornings and looking now at Chris, freshly cleaned and still dripping water from his hair, I couldn't help but sigh. You really can't compare one person to another. Chris handed me a set of new clothes, still folded neatly, a luxurious set of sleepwear only available in high-end stores and purchased with foreign exchange coupons. I took it hesitantly. You prepared this? Chris's face turned red, a rare sight compared to his usual carefree demeanor. I thought you'd like it. I do, I said sincerely. After washing up, I turned off the lights. It has to happen sooner or later. Might as well get it over with so I can sleep a little longer. But unlike my past life, this time was completely different. Chris was gentle and considerate, stopping to ask each time I showed even a slight discomfort. Eventually, I had to silence him myself. I didn't even know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, everything felt clean and fresh. Chris was already gone, and next to the pillow was a brand new outfit. I quickly got dressed and went downstairs. As a new bride, it was tradition to make the first breakfast. However, as soon as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw Chris's mother chatting with an elegant older woman. When they noticed me, Chris's mother waved me over. Lillian, you're awake. Breakfast is still hot. She pulled me to sit on the sofa. When I got a good look at the woman's face, I froze. In my past life, I had met her once when I was doing odd jobs to make ends meet. On my way home, I had found her lying unconscious in the snow, likely from low blood sugar. I carried her back to my house, and when she woke up, she asked me about my name, my address, and who my husband was. At the time, I had only managed to say Nathan before rushing off to cook. Not long after that, Nathan had been promoted. The woman smiled warmly at me. Do you know me? I quickly shook my head. Chris's mother, worried I might be hungry, insisted I eat before heading out. Then she and the woman took me to watch my performance. Standing on stage, I didn't care about anyone watching. I was confident, knowing I was the brightest star in the room. A year passed in the blink of an eye. My life was so fulfilling and happy that I rarely thought about my previous life. One day, Chris came home and said he needed to make a donation. He asked me for some money. That's when I learned that Gwen's husband had died. All platoon leaders and above were required to donate. So I handed him 2 large bills. Chris frowned. That's too much. My rank isn't high. Giving too much will draw attention. 1 bill is enough. Keep the other and use it to buy something you want. I smiled at him. Chris always handed all his money over to me, even asking me to collect his paycheck for him. Chris's mother wholeheartedly approved of this, often giving me money herself or taking me out shopping. When we returned home that evening, Chris held me in his arms and explained what had happened. Gwen's husband had died because of a misjudgment on Nathan's part. Overcome with guilt, Nathan had taken Gwen and her children into his home. Since Nathan still wasn't married, no one objected to him bringing them in. I froze for a moment. In my previous life, Nathan often had sleepless nights. Could this have been the reason? But why didn't he tell me? Gwen stood hesitantly at the doorway. Nathan looked around the dim and quiet house, suddenly struck by a strange feeling that it wasn't supposed to be this way. The house should have been filled with the aroma of food, the sound of children laughing, and even though it might have been crowded, it should have been clean and warm. A gentle woman should have been there, asking about his day and tending to him with care. Somehow, Nathan felt this was how it was meant to be. Gwen tugged at his sleeve, pulling him from his thoughts. Nathan nodded and allowed them to enter. Nathan's actions were soon praised, and word of his generosity quickly reached his mother. In her eyes, Nathan was the most capable man, someone who could even marry the daughter of a commanding officer. How could she allow a widow to hold him back? Nathan's mother packed up her belongings and moved in as well. The household became a chaotic mess, filled with constant arguments. Gwen went around telling everyone how miserable her life was, accusing Nathan's mother of mistreating her and taking advantage of her widow's pension. The chaos left Nathan overwhelmed, unable to face it. He started sleeping at the barracks instead of coming home. What had once been praised as an honorable act now became the subject of mockery. One day, as I was passing by the barracks to visit Chris, I saw Gwen trying to storm out with her 2 children, while Nathan, red-faced, stood in her way. Gone was the calm and composed Gwen from my past life. She pointed at Nathan angrily. In the morning, I cook for your mother, and she complains it's too hot or that I don't know how to manage a household. At night, I have to fetch her water to wash her feet and clean out the chamber pot. I've never said a word of complaint. I'm already grateful you let us stay here. But we need money to survive. You give your entire paycheck to others, leaving only $15, which your mother controls. Everyone else gets help. But what about me? What about my children? You said you'd take care of us. But this is how you do it. Using my widow's pension to support your whole family. Nathan broke out in a cold sweat. I've never thought of it that way, he retorted. I make over $100 a month. Why would I need you to support us? Gwen let out a mocking laugh. Do you even hear yourself? You give $20 to each of the 5 families of your soldiers in need. That leaves you with $15. And that $15? It's taken by your mother. My son needs money for school. And your mother wants to eat meat. I've been wearing the same clothes for a year. Scared they'll tear. I don't even have fabric for patches. Nathan's face darkened. How can you be so selfish? Don't you have any compassion? With thinking like that, how can you call yourself a soldier's wife? Those same words. He had once said them to me. And back then, Gwen had defended him. Nathan, what Lillian is doing is wrong, she had said. I may not be well educated, but I understand the importance of compassion and mutual aid. A person shouldn't be so selfish. Nathan had looked at Gwen with admiration, as if she were a paragon of virtue, while treating me like a worthless piece of trash. But now, Gwen snapped back at him. Fine, give me the money, and I'll make sure your mother eats meat at every meal. Can compassion fill my stomach? Can it keep my son from starving? Let's survive first before we talk about compassion. Their argument escalated, both pulling at each other's shoulders. Nathan caught sight of me watching from a distance and froze. His expression filled with regret and a tinge of longing. He seemed to be thinking that if he had married me instead, none of this would have happened. With my understanding and willingness to sacrifice, I would have supported and encouraged him. I didn't even bother looking at him again and walked away without a word. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Eventually, the company commander intervened, deciding that the financial support would end. Gwen and Nathan's mother would each receive half of his remaining $15. However, the families of the soldiers who had been receiving Nathan's aid were furious. For them, $20 was a significant amount, and losing it was unacceptable. They caused such an uproar that higher authorities stepped in, ordering all dependents and soldiers involved to return home. From then on, private financial aid among soldiers was strictly forbidden. This matter completely blocked the path for soldiers who were genuinely in need. Nathan's reputation was thoroughly ruined. He couldn't even lift his head when he went out, and no one spoke to him anymore. His upward trajectory was entirely cut off. By the time Chris received an external transfer, Nathan was still just a low-ranking platoon leader, carrying a small bag. I was about to leave when Chris's mother, concerned, tried to stop me. Lillian, don't go. You've just gotten pregnant. It's still unstable. Chris chimed in. Maybe I shouldn't go either. Let's both stay. I reassured them that I was fine, turning to leave when I saw Nathan standing by the roadside. His posture was as straight as ever. Chris frowned tightly as Nathan approached. Lillian, can I have a word with you? I nodded and walked with him a short distance away. Nathan seemed uneasy. You're pregnant. I nodded again. I want a child who's just like Chris. So, you're doing well. I nodded once more. Nathan took a deep breath. I had a dream. In it, we got married. But because of various misunderstandings, I ended up living with Gwen. Later, you died, and I lost all value to her. By then, Gwen and her children had climbed to the top of the power hierarchy and threw me out. Even our child was dismissed from their job. We lived miserably. Nathan studied my expression carefully. Lillian, you should have married me. Right. He looked visibly disappointed. But somehow, I feel like this isn't how it was supposed to be. I was supposed to be the one climbing higher and higher. I didn't listen to what he was saying anymore. Turning away, I walked back to Chris, who was watching Nathan warily. Chris muttered under his breath, "What a lunatic." For the past 2 days, Nathan had been acting strangely, even asking Chris if he knew anything about a red hat next year. "I'm not a fortune teller," Chris had replied. "How could I know that?" A chill ran through me. Nathan wasn't confirming a dream. He was testing to see if I had been reborn too. When I turned back, Nathan was already gone. I let out a deep breath. My life now was good, and I would never repeat the mistakes of my past. In the years that followed, Nathan earned countless commendations on the battlefield, as if trying to redeem himself in a single lifetime. Eventually, he sent Gwen and her children away, but Gwen betrayed him, reporting him to the authorities. Though Nathan had tried to control Gwen, she had overheard too much. On the day Nathan was arrested, Chris was promoted again. I sat in the audience holding our twin sons while Chris's father personally attached his new insignia to his uniform. Our 2 little boys clapped their hands red, cheering, "Daddy is amazing." I smiled at Chris. I loved him, but I didn't lean on him completely. That, I believed, was the key to the best kind of marriage.